Hello, my name is David Birnbaum, and on the other side, we have Emma Birnbaum, my daughter. We are talking about the old generation versus the new generation, and definitely I'm the old generation, Emma's the new generation. Every generation sees that they have to reject the previous generation, only to be rejected by themselves by the next generation. This time around, we have real issues. The industry we are in, the global garment industry, has issues that have been going on now for 30, 40 years, and it is a time of change. The whole world is changing, and we have to change with it. And we are looking at two things. First of all, how is the culture of our world changing? And secondly, how will companies in our industry deal with those changes? There are companies that don't believe that there's change. They believe that after the virus is over, we're going to return to business as usual. Okay, we don't have to talk about them because they probably won't be around. But in the area of the new companies, or the people who want to be the new companies, there is a debate going on. What will that industry be like? And what do they have to do to be on the cutting edge of those industries? For example, we know that the consumer is changing, where once the consumer was interested in acquisition, in buying stuff. Today, the consumer is more interested in lifestyle, more interested in doing things. We can see this because rather than buying clothes, consumers are renting clothes. And rather by looking at the latest and newest thing, there is a tremendous market for what people call pre-loved clothing. This is a shift which is going to change our industry. Some companies of the old generation are trying to deal with this. You go into a Nike store today, the latest Nike store, and it is one great experience. The bells and the lights and everything is excitement. That is Nike's version of where the industry is going. You go into an Apple store, and what you're in is some sort of temple to high tech. Serious people looking at serious high tech problems with experts there to advise you. There is a move towards the no store. Seriously, brick and mortar stores, particularly in the upmarket area and in the area of the upmarket malls, are now presenting themselves as cultural events, where going in to buy the clothing is secondary to the seminars that are going on, to the musical offerings that are going on. You can go into a modern mall today, and there are places where professionals will help you save your marriage, while next door, other professionals will help you leave your marriage. This is the new world that we're all entering, and we have to play a part in this. Emma, where are you in this?
So I think that when we talk about generational shifts, and it's very clear where the consumer is. It's very clear what the consumer wants because it's all there on social media, right? You can't look at any app without having some sort of representation about what one niche market wants and what another niche market wants, how consumers want to shop, how consumers want to consume information, and how they want to interact with product. The great revolution for consumerism really was Instagram. Forget about e-commerce, forget about bricks to clicks. The ability to look at a product that you might want to buy being worn by somebody who's actually interacting in the world and carrying out a lifestyle that you either want to emulate or that reflects who you already are. That is where the consumer really wants to ascertain whether or not to buy a product. And I think while that is so clear, understanding how the industry is going to reformat itself to be able to appeal or be able to respond to this change in circumstances is still very ambiguous. You have credible factories who really understand technology, understand design. They have, a reasonable understanding of what consumerism is today. And they're trying to realign themselves with what the future is going to look like, or at least some semblance of the future. But I think at the end of the day, one of the biggest problems that we have is within the customer, the brand space, where there is this dichotomy between older traditional brands, whether they are the Nikes, or VF, for example, who are really making an effort to step forward, understand how to develop new relationships with their suppliers, understand how dynamic the consumer is. And that's great. But then you also have newer brands who originate from the consumer space, even if they have gone through to design school, even if they have experience in retail. They originate innately understanding the gaps in the market that even successful brands are unable to fill. And I think this is where the question really lies. If somebody had asked me 5 years ago, 2 years ago, where I thought the industry would be at this point in time, I would have said, forget about all the old brands, forget about the high street. It's the new players that really understand the consumers. That's where it would be. That's where the industry will be. And let's face it, that's not true. You have a few very successful smaller brands, very successful new brands, but they really haven't replaced traditional brick and mortar and sort of traditional e-commerce, let's say. Even as around us, all over the Western world, you have these titans of industry, titans of retail that are failing left and right, mass bankruptcies, mass Chapter 11s. Every single day you read in the news, another company is closed. Yet there are no new companies that are really coming along to replace these older giants. And I think this is where we have to start questioning what's going on. Because while you do have success stories like Misguided or Boohoo in the UK, the reality is their business model really isn't different from the old business model of FOB pricing, forcing factories to cannibalize themselves, underpaying their workers. And this is not happening in places like Bangladesh, and it is, but it's really happening in the UK. So I think that really, before we can start making claims about what the future of the industry looks like, we have to start reconciling with the fact that everything that we've tried hasn't panned out yet.
Let me go interject. There are important issues here that you bring up. One of the most important of these is that the traditional brick and mortar stores are not doing well. This does not mean, in my mind, that brick and mortar is at the end of the cycle. In fact, I think there will be new brick and mortar operations that will be able to compete quite effectively with e-commerce. I mean, there is a great advantage to having a store. You can actually go in and try on the garment. You can feel the garment. You can hold it in your hand. You can't do that on the e-commerce. If there is a problem, it's because the brick and mortar stores have fallen behind. That's one side. When we talk about the factories, we have to realize that the industry on the supplier side has changed. You have billion-dollar factory groups today that have real clout. You have factories that are become strategic suppliers, whereby the product they make is special. You're in the wedding gown business. You're in the girls 6 to 16 business. You're in the bra business. These are horrible products, and only great factories can do well in it. Or you're in service, or you're in quality. If you can make an overcoat that is acceptable to Prada, you don't have to worry about finding customers. They'll stand in line for you. The factories are moving ahead, some of them at least, but they don't know quite where to go because they can't seem to interact with the industry itself. And I think this is the problem, because the factory is a supplier. There are possibilities. One is that the supplier might well just become the customer and throw the card people out altogether. And there's a strong, people are starting to do that. You know, factories are opening offices overseas. It's only a matter of time before they start bringing in young designers and give them the advantage of being able to make the samples, get it out, and do it at a reasonable price. That's a model for the future. There are infinite models for the future. The problem, because the future today is so difficult to understand, we don't know quite where to go. Emma, back to you.
Yes, I think that, you know, at the moment, what we're talking about is really we're asking more questions than delivering answers,
Yes.
which is probably necessary, but not as entertaining as giving the answers, right? Let's face it. And I think that when you talk about factories operating in a retail space, or at least operating in a hybrid space where maybe they don't become the brand themselves, but they establish numerous partnerships with influencers who have already developed brand identities, who already have a following, who already have proof that they have a high conversion rate, which means that the number of followers that they have actually turn into sales. Mm-hmm. So if you talk to an influencer, they can show you what percentage of the people who they interact with actually become consumers for the products that they represent. To me, this provides a really tangible avenue for factories to get behind. One, traditional customers are already pushing factories to produce small quantities of many designs. And one of the bonuses about this is because as we move out of economy of scale manufacturing into, you know, limited and small runs, you begin to be able to work with a much wider variety of different customers, because you're essentially making there are no trade-offs between a small customer and a big customer. And this gives factories the power to basically say, okay, I have a couple of customers that are reliable, but I'm going to branch out and develop new relationships that require new operational models. And in this case, I'm going to select 15 influencers who've proven to me that they have a brand. They've been around long enough. They have relationships within a community. They already work with established brands, and therefore they can prove their value. They can quantify their value. And I'm going to hire a bunch of designers to design for these influencers. And those designers are going to be located in New York and London and LA and wherever, and therefore will innately understand the aesthetics and the value systems of the consumers of the influencers. This, to me, is a really viable model, because the influencer essentially operates the way that a large brand would, but without the overhead of middle management and lots of operations that are essentially superfluous in the current industry. You know, they have a brand, they understand marketing, they have the ability to sell, they have the ability to drive consumers. That's what's necessary. Everything else can be offshored or at least contained within a factory in a buying office.
There's another part of this which is very important, that fits into your model. The consumer today wants very much what the consumers always wanted. They want good design, they want quality make, they want good prices. But there's now another area that they're interested in. This is ethical areas. They want sustainability. They're worried about global warming. They want ethical behavior level. They don't want that. The woman does not want the factory in a great position. When the customer, when the brand says, yes, we're sustainable, yes, we are ethical, that our people do not employ child labor, they're not talking about their office in New York and London, they're talking about their factory. Well, if you have a factory and your factory is sustainable and your factory is ethical, why don't you just brand the factory altogether? So if you are going to the influencers, you're not just going with a new concept of cutting out the middleman and delivering a more interesting product, but you are putting yourself in a position where the factory becomes a known entity to the consumer. I know that Emma and I have been discussing this for a very long time. In one model, and this is the most extraordinarily open-ended model, is that the idea of the brand as a retailer or the brand as a New York company or a London company might just disappear. And the brand will be the factory which owns the showroom in London, the showroom in New York. This is a very viable area. And let me add one thing. The good factories today are well capitalized. They can make the investment of time and effort to build this up. This is a very viable model.
Yes, I agree. And I think one of the areas that needs to be sort of diagnosed more thoroughly is the concept of value-led consumers, where yes, they're looking at aesthetics, but they're also looking at brands that represent who they personally are. And I think one of the issues that is frequently ignored is the fact that every person is a combination of many different values. And on top of that, each individual has constraints. They have time constraints, they have financial constraints, they might be constrained by geography or whether or not they have children. And frequently constraints and values are conflated. I value sustainability, but I'm financially constrained and therefore maybe I can't buy Stella McCartney, right? I value veganism. I would like to buy Stella McCartney. That's not possible. That is a constraint. And I think that the industry as a whole needs to start examining the difference, that if you are a single mom of 3 and you live in a podunk town in the middle of nowhere, you might really value sustainability, but Walmart isn't delivering on that. And therefore, you really don't have the option of being sustainable. And I think that these areas need to be examined, that consumers are more than just a few values. We all have many, many different values, and some of them are prioritized, but such as I really need to eat. That is a priority. I value eating. And therefore, I need to put my money towards that. Whereas I can't put my money towards making sure that my leather is halal. And I think that this might sound very simplistic, but it is often lost in the conversation when we're dealing with very hot topic issues, such as sustainability, such as gender inclusive clothing, non-binary clothing, racial representation and brand identity. Like, these are very, very, very important concepts, but they aren't superficial and they aren't easy to access. And I think that these concepts are where the factory can really optimize their value. because only the factory can control how a brand is able to deliver, such as sustainability. Everybody's talking about sustainability to the point where the term sustainability, while it may have originally had a definition, today there is no definition for sustainability. But a factory can quantify sustainability. They can tell you how much water was used. Was that water recycled? Was it pumped back into the ground? Did they use the drip method when the cotton was farmed? How much electricity went into running the washing machines? How much were workers paid? You know, a factory is the nexus of the quantifiable supply chain, and therefore playing a role as a brand in and of themselves that they can present to a consumer, which is where all the money is made. That is unbelievably valuable financially and also valuable socially. And the more that factories begin to realize just how they can weaponize their own value and how much the knowledge that they inherently generate is in demand, the stronger the factory will be.
What you say, these are two very important points. First of all, the leading factories, the ones at the cutting edge, have been into zero carbon footprint factories for over 10 years. You look at Brandix, you look at Heideramani. You know, in the beginning, the cost of a zero carbon footprint factory was maybe 30% above a normal factory, but that price is going down. The cost of water treatment is going down till it's very reasonable, and it's being done organically instead of mechanically. These things are changing, and the factories are beginning to recognize the nature and value of these so-called soft costs. We're going to be talking about this elsewhere, but let me say this. No consumer is going to buy a product because it's sustainable. They're not going to pay more for it. That is the truth. But the importance of this is that there is a certain percentage of consumers who will not buy the product if it is said to be unsustainable, who will not buy the product if they find out it has been produced by children. And it is this negative thing which is growing. Yes, 10 years ago, a few dreamers thought about sustainability and thought about CSR, corporate social responsibility. The people like Levi Strauss, the people like M&S, who've been doing it for 100 years. And we all, applauded, but we said, it's not unimportant. Today it is important, and it's growing in importance. And today the factories, as you say, have to control the process. And they can do it. They have the numbers. Yes, people point out, building a zero carbon footprint factory itself has a carbon footprint. Let's face it, you have machinery, that's true, but amortizing it, you can see the costs, the social costs are overwhelming. And I think that factories today are accepting this, even though many of their customers are not. In this sense, the factories are the cutting edge. My view is that what we are talking about now as a maybe thing is going to be a certainty, and it's going to be growing as time goes along. So let's face it, 12 years ago, 2012, when you had the disaster at Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, and 1,100 people, died as the building collapsed on them. It took Bangladesh a year, 2 years to recover. That happened today, they'd never recover. And the customers who were involved, they would be badly hurt. And people are seeing, the customer side and the legitimate factory side are seeing the need for this. One of the most interesting things that today Bangladesh is one of the leading countries whose industry is looking at sustainability. It is a remarkable change. And this is one of the things that's going to happen because the consumer is running things. We live in a consumer-orientated society, and we better to find out what the consumer wants and give it to them. Emma?
Yes, I mean, I think that that's true, and it's wonderful to hear that about Bangladesh. But I think that there's an extra role that factories, or that only the factory can play, which is educating the consumer. And will the fashion industry as a whole is very nebulous. It's very difficult to understand what's happening where. How many countries has my cotton white t-shirt had to go through in order to arrive in a London store? It's very difficult, even if you're inside the industry, to see how all of the different parts link up. And this is where big concepts like sustainability and ethics become confused. Brands, I personally don't think are actually capable. They don't have the information required to present a solid breakdown of ethics and sustainability. And I think one of the reasons why consumers are still, it's still unclear how much they care, is because they simply know that there's a lot of greenwashing going on. There's a lot of lip service, and they haven't got the facts. And it's very difficult as a consumer to recognize that this organic cotton, that this company that's called organic something or other, that might not be ethical. Actually, it might not even be sustainable, because pesticides are not the be all and end all of ethics and sustainability. People just don't know that. People don't know that organic cotton might be picked by children. They don't know that organic cotton, maybe consumes more water, or how much of the crop dies because of, I don't know, insects. And this is where but the factory does know, right? The factory is able to quantify this. They have the relationships, they have the resources, and therefore they can put into the clothes a label of, this is how much water was consumed, this is how much energy was consumed. And that knowledge will change the conversation entirely. Consumers will be able to say, I know that this pair of jeans is sustainable because of this, because it would be written inside of the jeans. And the value that a factory can play in providing that information is unparalleled. And it's also something that consumers really want, and therefore, but are unable to acquire because it just doesn't exist within the consumer market.
Here, this is a major problem, and it's just not a garbage industry problem. We live in an era of informed cynicism. If you advertise a product, the immediate reaction from consumers, they're lying to me. And you have to escape from that. The internet has brought tremendous amount of data, tremendous information. Unfortunately, it's brought about a whole industry of con men and crooks. And we have to escape from that. And the only way of doing that is to bring the consumer directly into the process. For example, it is not enough to go to an influencer and make a relationship between the factory and the influencer. The influencer has to be able to go out to the factory, to talk to people, to see what's going on, so that they can come back and say, yes, this is the information. You have to bring in the real professionals, the serious media people, to look at what you're doing. If you can do this, if you can establish a reputation as being reliable, as being honest, one of the best examples is a company like H&M. H&M is the easiest company to actually talk to, and they have many problems. And they're going to tell you about the problems if you ask them. They're not hiding things. I'm a great fan of H&M. Other companies are. Other companies, say they're doing something and they're not. We have to move to an area where we're dealing with credible people, and we have to insist in credibility. How we're going to do this, that's another project. Our world is changing. And when we come out of the tunnel, it's going to be a different world. where people are going to be able to have reliable information, where people are going to be able to get the garment they want and pay for it. One of the things we know is that the consumer will pay for value. If you look at the data and you look at the largest garment exporting countries in the world, the truth is that China, which is a relatively high labor cost country, and the EU, which is an unbelievably high labor exporting group, represent about 58% of all garment exports today. The consumer will pay for value. And if the consumer will pay for value, we have to give them that value. Never?
Well, I think that sums it up. But I do think that there's more to say about generational shifts in the industry beyond the consumer. Do you agree?
Yes. Lead on.
Good. Because I think that, you know, there's a lot has been said about the consumer. Some of it correct, some of it questionable. But I do think that one of the issues, and this is something that David and I have found, is that our interpretation of the world, just because of our age difference and our experience and our understanding, you know, of technology and information, has created, let's say, slight schisms in the way that we assess problems, the way that we assess change. And I think that these differences can be seen throughout industry, throughout you know, my relationships with people of my, you know, let's say millennial generation who are taking over their factories from their parents, have totally different visions from their parents, and therefore they then have to justify those visions. When I'm told what their vision is, such as I have a friend in Pakistan who is taking over a textile factory. He wants to move into high valued fashion goods, not designer fashion, but what I would say new luxury fashion. So Ghani, Samso, a lot of the brands that are coming out of sort of Sweden and Norway and Denmark, where those brands are redefining how luxury is viewed, where value is everything, quality is everything, sustainability is very important. But at the same time, they don't see slapping on like an extra high price tag to be inherent to the value that they create and the way that their brand views themselves. So a really good example of this would be Christopher Raven, which is a London brand, and they have, under one brand name, Christopher Raven, they have 3 different levels of luxury price goods. So they have the ultra high couture level of, they only produce one item with fabric that doesn't exist anywhere else except for in their studio, and it, you know, they're making things out of silk maps that were, you know, manufactured in World War I, like beautiful things that are ridiculously expensive. Then they have their sort of secondary level, which is, you know, maybe polyester maps instead of silk maps. But then they have their lowest level where they're making t-shirts, screen printed t-shirts in their London-based studio, beautiful cotton, but they retail for like 30 or 40 pounds. They want to attract all consumers that share their values, their aesthetic values, their social values, their technological values. And therefore they don't discriminate between, do you carry a Birkin handbag or are you carrying something from like Primark? They want everybody who's interested in who they are, what their brand represents. And this to me is a really big shift in terms of how the industry operates, because we're looking at luxury that originated with this notion of, we are manufacturing for a tiny percentage of the population, to these traditional brands that have essentially in my opinion, over leveraged their brand recognition to the point where they really operate more as a fast fashion company, like more like a Zara company. That's less competent than Zara, but more similar to that, where the quantity that they need to sell is pretty substantial, to brands that are very niche market orientated. They're not so concerned with price validating their identity, but they're very focused on delivering what they believe to be essential, whether it's aesthetic, whether it's social. And therefore the brand, the price tag of the product is representative of the work that needs to go into that product. And this is really the future of, in my opinion, the future of all fashion, whether you're talking about Primark prices or whether you're talking about couture prices. And what we're seeing more and more are consumers who are also reflecting these values, where buying secondhand, as David was saying at the beginning, the pre-loved market is, I think, about to gross to $2.1 trillion in the coming future, which is sizable. And it's massive, right?
Yeah.
I think in the next 5 to 10 years, that secondhand can be secondhand Primark, secondhand can also be secondhand Dolce & Gabbana. But the consumers that are buying secondhand Primark are also eyeing up the Dolce & Gabbana because it becomes immensely more affordable. And it might not be a beautiful dress. It could just be a belt buckle. But we're looking at a true democratization of value systems and aesthetics. And there are many roads to acquiring what the consumer wants.
And one of the points that should be made here is that our industry costs, from the factory to the retail price, is bizarre. It is totally beyond reason. I don't want to go into this, but in any other world, these people would be put into a padded cell. This is the only industry in the world where you can buy for 1, sell for 10, and go broke. This is an unbelievable, and because of that anomaly, the door has been opened to people who, yes, I will charge because I put something into the garment. And in doing so, the prices they're going to come up with, or the profits they're going to make, are enormous. You know, you have people literally who buy for $10 in the factory, are selling for $80, and at the end are lucky to make $5 profit because of the costs that they've added in. Having spent a lifetime in this, I still can't get my head around what goes on here. There are models out there where, when our industry today, if you're running a retail operation, successful major retail operation, you're lucky to make 6%, while the guy who's making your iPad or supplying social networking, they're netting 32%. Well, we can do the same at a lower cost because of all the money that's lost, provided we concentrate on what we're in business to do, that is deliver a product. And people, young people who are not blessed with our insanity, they will take one look at this and they think, I can do better. And you know, one of the things that Emma hasn't mentioned is that many of these people who are going into the e-commerce business have no knowledge of garments, but they have MBAs. They understand costings, and they are going to change the industry. We are wide open now to change.
You know, going off of what you just said, David, I think that this is where, let's say, people of your generation can really benefit and maybe pat themselves on the back. A lot of the, let's say, startup or newer SME companies that I'm familiar with have trouble because, while they have really good ideas and they have the know-how in terms of like executing the sort of finite elements of their ideas, they really don't understand anything about the global garment industry. And this, to me, is the real crux of the problem, that it's not enough to be able to identify a gap in the market. It's not enough to be able to understand your consumer or to understand the technology that goes into delivering for the consumer. You need to understand the people behind the product, the people behind the operational side of the industry. And you need to start building those relationships and valuing what they value. And this, to me, is really where, let's say, my generation really has kind of missed the boat. That what I'd say we see is a whole bunch of boomer companies failing and thinking like, dear God, I can do better than that. And the truth is, I question that notion, because while I've become acquainted with a lot of these companies, and I can see that they've created some profoundly innovative products, they have no idea how to plug it into a pre-existing system, or even how to go about changing that pre-existing system. They don't know how to quantify their own value, how to relate to relate to potential partners that could facilitate their own establishment within the industry. And this is where I think people like you, David, can play a much bigger role, because that knowledge is to a large degree aggregated over time. And in our industry, because the bar of entry is so high, you basically have to be born into it, or come from Hong Kong. There are just no ways of obtaining the knowledge, or it's very difficult to obtain the knowledge as an outsider.
Let me say this. I'm going to take your side. The problem is not with the e-commerce startup. The problem is on our side, because it is our job to create a way that the e-commerce startup can take their excellent idea and, through our efforts, put together the pattern making, the grading, the factory, the shipping, the whole thing, so that the e-commerce startup can do what they do best: design and get themselves a label. We've written about this. There is a wide open market on the supply side for any country that wants to take over the supplying of these small e-commerce startups. We all talk about how the SME companies are dying. Well, this was an opportunity for SME factories, the guy with 40 machines, to make a fortune. If the government in his country will sit down and have a central location where they can take the garment, the sample that is sent to us by the designer, and put it together so that the 40 machine factory can produce it, and then that we can ship it out, we can run the logistics to make sure that we're getting the best price. The profits are enormous. And we people on the production side, on the supply side, must play a role here.
Yeah, but I think that what you said that's really important is the responsibility of the government to collaborate with industry in order to facilitate innovation and development. And I know this is something that I've harped on a lot about, David, okay, which is that the sort of post-Reagan world is very different from the pre-Reagan world. And the notion that governments are responsible for investing in infrastructure and education cannot be taken for granted. I mean, I think I've only been living in the UK for 3 years, but one thing that's been made incredibly clear to me by industry, by government, and just by the general public is that there is no real, government doesn't really believe that their responsibility is to invest in industry. They don't really believe that their responsibility is to facilitate training or education, that they need to, build better streets and establish better internet connections. And the deficit of new technology, better industry education, and essentially non-crumbling infrastructure, and actually applying the pre-existing laws and regulations is being brutally felt by industries that are trying to grow and innovate and establish themselves, because it creates a very, very battered down playing field where essentially to be successful at all, you really can't do anything positive. And I think that this has to be grappled with, especially when, sorry, I don't mean to be accusatory, but when your generation has stripped out a lot of the value over time.
Let me answer. And this is generating into a private joke. Em and I are working on projects in this area. We both agree that this type of industry-government relationship is absolutely necessary if you're going to build a successful industry in the future. Unfortunately, the place to do that right now does not seem to be the UK. It seems to be Singapore. It seems to be in Asia.
Or in places like Sweden, right?
Yes.
Sweden is open.
Yes. Well, because Sweden has a history of this. But these are countries that if you have a plan, if you have credibility, if you understand what you're doing, and there will be an increase of GDP, more jobs, more money going into the country, they'll put up seed money, they'll put up the money. In the UK, I don't want to say negative things, but boohoo exists because of the government.
Yeah. I mean, you can make that same claim for Amazon, right? Amazon's misbehavior and
I can make a claim. I can make the claim anyway. In Tennessee, the people who are growing tobacco, I mean, it's all, it goes on everywhere. But in some countries, they seem to be able to be better adapted to avoid this. Not many, but the future will be in those countries.
Yeah, agreed.
Anyway, where are we going now?
Do you have another topic that you would like to discuss is related to generational shifts?
It's funny. There is more Chinese history, written history, than the sum total of history from all the other countries in the world. Because in the past, each new dynasty would write the history of the previous dynasty. And even though they thought their dynasty would last forever, they recognized that they should be honest and give the old dynasty an even break, because one day somebody is going to be writing their history. People of your generation might want to sit down and consider how years from now people look back at your generation and say, they put us in this terrible position. That's the nature of progress. That's the nature of humanity.
Yes, I appreciate what you're saying. Do I agree with it?
Okay.
No, but I can see where you're coming from.
I mean, one thing that's obvious is that we've left the door open for dramatic dynamic change because it's a matter of survival at this point. So yes, you have to dig us not out of our generation's mess, but the mess for the last 50 years.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So maybe we can end on a more positive note.
It's the nature of our work, of M&I work, that people come to us with problems. That's what we do. We solve other people's problems. And it gives you a very negative view of things, because people don't come to us and say things are going great, we just wanted to let you know. They rather come with us and say, well, we have a slight problem. It's taking 30 years for us to get into this problem. Can you solve it by next Thursday? So it gives us a sense of real cynicism.
But I would say the reality is that a lot more people are recognizing problems today. They're much less reticent to let problems sort of metastasize over a long time. And I do see optimism in that the people in the industry are serious. There is a serious desire to change, and that what we need now is to develop tactics to figure out how, and methodologies to figure out how to implement that change. But I do see a lot of individuals from all different generations, all different regions of the world, who are ready to do the work and who are ready to make the investment necessary. And that I feel very positive about.
Well, based on the projects we're doing, you might be right. Thank you. Thank you, APLF, for inviting us to speak on this topic.
Thank you,
Emma?
APLF.